At exactly 6:32 a.m., the gates of Rose Hill Cemetery stood open, but the grounds were still empty. Only one man stood motionless beneath the fading orange hues of the morning sky, 72-year-old Master Sergeant Harold Whitaker. He wasn't there for ceremony or show. He was there because this was the only way he knew how to say goodbye. Dressed in the same navy blue suit he had worn to his wife's retirement party 15 years earlier, and to receive his own Distinguished Service Medal 3 decades ago, Harold looked both smaller and stronger than people remembered. His shoulders remained square, chin raised, shoes polished to military standard, but the suit hung looser on his aging frame now, the lines on his face deeper, like battle scars left by time rather than war. Before him was a fresh grave, the earth still unsettled. The name on the headstone read, Elaine Marie Whitaker, beloved wife, mother, and anchor. Harold had been standing there for nearly 2 hours. He whispered things only she would understand. Memories, regrets, old jokes they used to laugh at when no one else was around. He recited their wedding vows under his breath, pausing longer at the words, till death do us part. That part didn't seem fair. Not today. For Harold, this wasn't just grief, it was duty. In the Army, you don't leave your partner behind. And Elaine, she hadn't worn a uniform, but she'd fought beside him through deployments, surgeries, insomnia, and the long silence after Vietnam. She was the only one who understood why he sometimes flinched at fireworks, or why he always sat facing the door in restaurants. She was his battle buddy in every way that counted. Around him, the cemetery was still. Birds barely chirped, the wind too respectful to stir. The American flag on a nearby veteran's grave hung low, as if observing the solemn ritual. A single rose lay across Elaine's headstone, the stem slightly bent, as if even the flower understood the weight of this goodbye. Harold had no idea what was about to happen. He thought he'd come to say farewell. But what unfolded next would remind everyone watching that some veterans never stop serving, and some farewells deserve more than silence. Officer Ryan Delgado had only been on the force for 7 months. Young, ambitious, and eager to prove he could handle real responsibility, he had requested the early morning shift that day. When dispatch reported an unidentified male loitering after hours in Rose Hill Cemetery, Delgado didn't hesitate. He assumed it would be a routine call, maybe a homeless man seeking shelter, or someone trespassing without permission. As his cruiser rolled up the long gravel path between rows of headstones, the engine disturbed the stillness like a loud voice in a church. He spotted the figure immediately, an older man in a suit standing completely still beside a fresh grave. Delgado stepped out and adjusted his duty belt. "Sir," he called, his tone already edged with authority, "the cemetery isn't open to the public right now. I'm going to need you to step away." Harold didn't move. He heard the voice, but he wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Not before he finished telling Elaine about the photo albums he'd finally organized, or how their youngest granddaughter had learned to whistle, just like her. "Sir," the officer repeated, stepping closer, now more firm. "This is city property. You're trespassing. I need you to comply." Harold finally turned slowly. "I've been here since the service yesterday," he said calmly. "I just stayed. I didn't mean to break any rules." Delgado noticed the shaking in the man's hands, mistook it for defiance rather than age. "I'm going to ask you one last time, sir. Step away from the grave and exit the grounds." "I just need a little more time," Harold replied, voice soft but steady. "We were married 47 years. I promised her I wouldn't leave her alone." Delgado sighed in frustration. Training had taught him how to handle non-compliance. Escalate with presence, control the scene. He radioed for backup, reporting a non-cooperative subject, elderly male, maybe mentally unstable or under influence. Minutes later, 2 additional squad cars arrived. Officers stepped out, assessing the situation quickly, but only through the lens of procedure. One asked Harold to show ID. Another moved in behind him. Harold, overwhelmed, sank onto a bench beside the grave. The tremor in his hands worsened. "I'm not resisting," he said quietly. "I'm just tired." But in their eyes, sitting down equaled non-compliance. What happened next was fast, clinical, and devastating. Hands pulled him up. Words flew key. "Stand up. Hands behind your back." His old knees buckled. The metal cuffs were cold. unyielding. He didn't fight. He couldn't. But they treated him like he might. As they led him toward the patrol car, Harold caught one last glimpse of Elaine's name carved into granite. Her memory, her warmth, everything they'd built, all of it felt suddenly fragile under the weight of what was happening. To the officers, it was just another call. To Harold, it was the day he was forced to leave his wife alone, in handcuffs. The click of the handcuffs echoed too loudly in the quiet cemetery. For Harold Whitaker, it wasn't just the metal tightening around his wrists, it was the symbolic undoing of everything he had stood for. He had served with integrity, carried wounded men across enemy lines, built a life of service and silence. And now, on the most personal battlefield of his life, he was being treated like a trespasser. The officers moved to escort him to the patrol car, their grip firm but not brutal. Yet every step felt like a betrayal. To Elaine, to his country, to the years of sacrifice that were supposed to mean something. When he stumbled, it wasn't resistance. It was grief, wrapped in 72 years of age and the unbearable weight of loss. But Officer Delgado didn't see that. He saw a man disobeying. Resisting, Delgado said, raising his radio. Subject unstable. Then came the words that ignited the spark. Deploying taser. Harold didn't even have time to protest. A crackling sound filled the air, followed by the snap of voltage tearing through his body. His knees collapsed, his vision blurred. And the only sound that escaped his lips was not a scream, but a deep, broken cry from him. A sound no man makes unless something vital has been torn from him. It was that sound that carried across the hills of Rose Hill Cemetery. It was that sound that reached the ears of 7 men in uniform standing just outside the cemetery gate. They had arrived together, summoned not by orders but by loyalty. Tommy Ramirez, a 28-year-old Marine sergeant, had been one of the first to hear what was happening. A neighbor had called, then another. They're arresting that old vet who lost his wife. He's still in his funeral clothes. Tommy didn't hesitate. He called every Marine he trusted who lived within 10 minutes. Formation, dress blues, Oak section, now. They came, one by one, then together, all in uniform, not to protest, not to argue, just to stand. Now, from the edge of the cemetery, they saw the man they had once heard speak at VFW halls, the man who showed them how to load their first M16 properly, the man who called everyone son like it still meant something. That man was on the ground, shaking, tasered, cuffed. Tommy didn't speak. He just nodded. In formation, they moved forward. 7 sets of polished shoes clicked on the stone walkway. 7 upright backs, 7 chests filled with restrained fury. They didn't need signs. They were the sign. Delgado noticed them first. His posture faltered when he saw their uniforms. Pressed, immaculate, authoritative in the way no badge could match. The crowd gathered by the gates grew quiet as they approached. Even the backup officers began to lower their hands. Tommy broke formation and walked directly to the patrol car. Sir, respectfully, he said to the nearest officer, you're detaining Master Sergeant Harold Whitaker, Bronze Star recipient, 2-tour veteran. He just buried his wife today. The name hit like a bullet of truth. Some of the officers blinked. One lowered his radio, another removed his hand from his taser. Tommy continued, you may not know who he is, but I do. He spoke at my cousin's enlistment. He taught me how to hold a firing stance in crosswind. He carried 3 men out of a fire zone and never bragged once about it. Today you put him on his knees, on the day he said goodbye to his wife of 47 years. Delgado stammered. He was trespassing, past hours, wouldn't comply. Tommy didn't yell. He didn't need to. His voice cut deeper in its steadiness. He wasn't trespassing. He was keeping watch, the way every soldier does for those they love. One of the other Marines stepped forward and knelt beside Harold, checking for signs of injury. He needs water, he said, and dignity. More people had gathered now, neighbors, strangers, a few veterans who heard and came quietly. Phones recorded, but no one spoke. The power had shifted, not through intimidation, but through presence, through the weight of honor in motion. Delgado's supervisor arrived, pale and stiff. The cemetery director soon followed, confirming Harold had been granted extended visitation permission for the day of the funeral. The charges dissolved as quickly as they had been spoken. The taser report was quietly filed, but the silence that followed was not one of shame, it was one of revelation. The Marines helped Harold to his feet. He said nothing for a while, just looked each of them in the eye. Then finally he whispered, "Elaine would have liked this. All this noise for me." Tommy smiled softly. "We're not here for noise, sir. We're here to make sure you finish what you came to say." News travels fast when injustice is public and a hero is humiliated. By the next morning, cell phone videos had circulated across social media. The headlines wrote themselves: "Veteran arrested at wife's grave." "Bronze Star recipient tased for grieving too long." "Marine unit silently stands guard over fallen comrade." Within hours, the video hit national veteran forums and Facebook groups filled with former service members. The comments overflowed with one word: disgrace. But alongside that came another word, repeated with equal force: respect. Respect for the Marines who stood up, respect for Harold Whitaker's service, and growing outrage toward the officers who failed to see beyond a uniformless old man. Officer Delgado, once eager for a career of promotions, now found himself under internal investigation. The taser deployment, the wrongful arrest, the failure to de-escalate, all of it was caught on body cam footage and public phones. Even officers who wanted to defend procedure struggled to justify the lack of basic empathy. Delgado was placed on leave pending review. His supervisors issued a formal apology to Harold, but apologies don't undo handcuffs. The department held a press conference. The chief, himself a retired Air Force reservist, delivered a carefully worded statement. "Mr. Whitaker's experience does not reflect the values of our department. We recognize his sacrifice, and we are taking steps to ensure such a situation never happens again." Policy was swiftly amended. Officers would now require supervisory clearance before arresting any individual over 65 for nonviolent infractions. It was unofficially called the Whitaker Protocol. But the greatest response didn't come from city halls or policy boards. It came from people. The day after the incident, dozens of strangers arrived at Rose Hill Cemetery. Veterans, neighbors, students, even a few off-duty cops. They brought flowers, not just for Elaine's grave, but for Harold himself. A thank you, an apology, a gesture of human decency. They shook his hand, they saluted, some cried. The cemetery installed a small wooden bench near Elaine's headstone with a bronze plaque that simply read, "For Harold and Elaine, 47 years together, still standing watch." And then came the letters. Harold's mailbox filled with envelopes from across the country, old friends, men he'd trained, children of soldiers he once saved. Civilians who had never served, but wrote to say they had been moved by his quiet dignity. One letter came from a congresswoman, herself a former Army medic, inviting him to speak at a Memorial Day event. Another came from the local high school, requesting he address their students about service, love, and what it means to stand by your promises. But Harold didn't want speeches. He wanted silence. He wanted to visit Elaine, now with fewer interruptions and more peace. Still, when Tommy and the other Marines offered to walk with him to her grave the next Thursday, he accepted. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Harold sat beside Elaine, fingers tracing the edge of her name. The Marines stood quietly behind him in respectful formation. They had no orders, no mission, just loyalty. Before leaving that day, Harold turned to Tommy and said, "Thank you for reminding me that duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off." Tommy replied, "No, sir, it doesn't, and some of us wear it on the inside." A week later, the cemetery was quiet again. No reporters, no patrol cars, no crowds with phones. Just Harold Whitaker in his navy blue suit, walking slowly along the gravel path, with 7 folded letters tucked neatly into his coat pocket. He stopped at Elaine's grave and sat on the bench that now bore both their names. The autumn wind was gentle, rustling the last golden leaves, as if nature itself were paying tribute. Harold placed the letters in a small wooden box he had carved by hand, each letter addressed to one of the Marines who had stood for him that day. In every one he had written not just gratitude, but legacy. He wanted them to know that their silent march had done more than protect him. It had protected the dignity of every man and woman who had ever served, especially those who no longer wore the uniform. Elaine used to tell him that courage wasn't always loud, that sometimes it was simply the act of standing still when everything else tried to push you down. That lesson had come full circle. Harold sat a while longer, speaking quietly to the stone, as he always did, not with sadness now, but with a strange peace. He had said his goodbye. And somehow, through all the noise and humiliation and redemption, Elaine had never really felt far. As he stood to leave, a father and his teenage son passed nearby. The boy recognized him from the news. "Sir," the boy said, hesitating, "you're the man who—" Harold smiled gently and nodded. "I'm just someone who stayed a little too long." "No," the boy said, his voice steady. "You're someone who reminded us what not giving up looks like." Harold placed his hand on the boy's shoulder for a brief moment. Then he turned and walked down the hill, back to a world that, thanks to a few Marines and a whole lot of heart, had finally remembered how to honor its own. If this story touched your heart, we'd be honored to have you with us. Each day we share quiet moments that remind us what still matters. You can subscribe below to join us.